Awesome. So I'm really thrilled to be here. I actually live in Mexico now, so it's really nice to be able to come home and come to a Canadian conference. So thank you all for being here. The talk is called Obey the Testing Goat, Building a Test-Obsessed Company, Test-Obsessed Culture at Your Company. Now, some of you may have heard of this reference to goats before. Some of you might be looking at me like I'm completely lost or losing you. So what's with the goat? And I luckily found this blog post to just show you all, but apparently at a PyCon before my time, it was used as a knee-jerk reaction to, oh my gosh, we need to stop having so many lolcats at this conference. So we're going to have a test writing culture, or a test writing talk with goats as the images. Some of you may have seen there's a book that someone, I guess, took this from and took this name. So yeah. So I'm early career, which tends to have less power or any sort of influence at a company. I've mostly done back-end web stuff, so that tends to affect the kind of tests that I'm actually writing. And I'm also pretty new at the job that I'm at right now. But yeah, this is all just what worked for me. If it doesn't work for you, you don't like it, whatever my advice is, take other people's advice. There are lots of other ways to do this out there. Mine is just one of them. So what's the actual problem that we're trying to solve? For me, we don't have any unit tests in one of our main projects that lives in prod right now, and that's unbelievably terrifying to me. If you push to prod and you have no unit tests, I'm not really sure if you're doing gambling on a daily basis or if you like gambling, but this is a terrifying situation. But more than that, it's a people problem and it's an engineering problem. And people is culture. People is complicated and messy. And engineering is complicated and messy in a more logical way. So yeah. So your testing culture is broken. The culture is the social behavior and accepted norms of your company. So or at least for me, my code culture is that you don't write tests, and it's fine, and nothing happens, which, again, needs to change. Changing culture is really hard. It just really is. Nobody can tell me that they've worked at a company where they've managed to change the culture, and it took them 5 minutes, a pip package, and, you know, they learn to juggle at the end, too. Like, that's just not how this works. So it takes a couple of things. The two main ones that I think are important here are repetition and reinforcement. So constantly making this a thing that you talk about at your company, like when you're doing the planning, let's say you're writing a ticket, if it's relevant to write what the unit test cases that you need to really cover because those are the really important ones, then do that. That's just going to reinforce that this person who picks up this ticket is expected to write the test. Cool. And then reinforcement is showing rewards to people who do the thing that you want to encourage, and I don't want to say punish because that's not quite the right word. It means that in psychology, but that's not what we're going for at work, but promote negative consequences for people that aren't doing what we want them to do. Luckily, everybody that I've ever met has wanted to be good at their job. So instead of having to convince people that testing is good, we have to convince them that writing tests makes you a good developer. So changing those things around can help you frame this problem a little bit better for yourself. So in regards to the engineering problem, you don't have tests, or you don't have enough tests, or you don't have the right tests. That means that regressions and breakages are a really, really, really terrifying situation that you're probably going to face all the time. You also probably don't want to write tests because you probably don't have enough infrastructure that makes it easy. When I say infrastructure, I mean stuff like maybe you've Dockerized all of the various dependencies that you aren't necessarily Python, but like your Celery stuff like that. And test fixtures, other stuff like that. Just code that you don't want to write every time you write a test, but if you don't have it, you have to write either like raw setting the values on objects, which just is a waste of everyone's time. And finally, testing is a skill that not everyone knows how to do. Maybe you've worked at places that just don't test before, and then now you work at your company and you've just never really had to do it, so you don't know how. Or maybe you're a new engineer and testing is not necessarily well covered in university courses. And that's a technical problem, not because, that's a technical problem specifically because it is a fixable problem by applying education to it, demonstrating good tests, giving people access to time to like go and personally develop themselves, that kind of stuff. So some unfortunate realities. You cannot just give up and write all the tests yourself. I know that some people just really like writing tests, but it's just not going to happen. Even if you have a single person code base, if you have other engineers on your team, consider having them also write tests. Another sad reality, tests are great, but they don't visibly add business value to the average person. So you're going to have to potentially fight people to convince them that this does add genuine value. A third problem, most people here are not legally allowed to torture their coworkers into doing stuff. Waterboarding is not a real solution for people skills. It's not approved. So you have to be persuasive. You have to convince these people, your coworkers, that you are selling the right thing. And finally, tests are useless unless you run them. Now, that may sound obvious, but if you don't have a CI machine that runs every PR before you merge it, you're not running your tests. It doesn't count. Because, yes, you can trust your coworkers to run all the tests, but it's just not the same. It's not equivalent, and you can't assume that, maybe you have a new engineer on your team or someone from another team has transferred in. You can't assume that they know that this is a rule if you don't have a CI machine. So what are we looking for to make ourselves, like what's the goal that we're striving for? So a good test suite will tell you that it meets the requirements. The code is doing what it's supposed to do and works, and everybody, including the person who has defined the specs, is happy. When I say actually test things on the slide, what I'm talking about is you've all seen a test where the test case and the the code that's actually being tested basically do the same thing, and then you compare them. That's not really testing. That's just hoping for consistency. It doesn't really work. So you've all seen a bad test like that. Now, the third point is a little bit of an odd one, but a good test suite will provide you with documentation on the intended usage of the code. So if you're not writing internal documentation for your personal or for your internal stuff, that's not surprising. A lot of people don't have it. Tests are more important, and I say tests are more important specifically because it is a direct demonstration of how the original author of the code intended for you to use the tests, which is huge. No one can tell me that saying free documentation isn't like the best thing and the most fun thing to say in the world. And then another fact about good tests, you want them to have instructions on how to set them up. Onboarding or new people from other places or your new computer, all of these times, if you can't figure out how to run the test, it slows people down. It makes them unhappy about what you're doing to them, torturing them because now they have to set up Postgres on their machine and then juggle and then download the entire test data dump to put into their machine. None of this is realistic. You want instructions, and you do not want any downloading of any suspicious, mysterious files, even if it's just from internal resources. Other stuff, you want to limit mocks as much as possible. You've all seen mocked code that's just testing mocks and moving mocks around, and you're just playing stack cup and just stacking a bunch of paper cards into a ridiculous pyramid of not tests. They're not real, they're imaginary tests. And finally, this is a little bit contentious, but most people don't plan a test suite in some ways, and that's fine, but planning in advance gets you a lot. So if you are adding a new feature or a new module, planning what mocks and infrastructure and tools you might need in advance, just so that you all are doing it the same way, it's super valuable because it means the tests are comparable when you have to switch context. You can understand them a lot more immediately. So having a test style is pretty good and pretty useful and something that you get to do if you don't have any, which we don't, so I'm really excited about that. Everybody has seen this before. People think that no one wants to write tests, or at least I think people don't think that they want to write tests. I don't like writing tests. I just don't. I understand people who do. It can be really fun, but I find it kind of monotonous. But people don't write tests the same way that kids don't like eating their vegetables as well. It's just not fun. So there's no consequences. If you have ever watched your kid put broccoli or something into the garbage can and then you didn't do anything, now they're going to keep doing it forever. The same thing applies for engineers. People are all the same depending on, or no matter what age they are. If there's nobody watching and no social pressure, and by that I mean, hey, I was reviewing your code last night and I saw that you didn't write any tests. What's going on? Or your tests are good, but there's not enough of them. What's going on? People will change a lot faster. You're all peers at your company, so convincing people to do something isn't as hard as convincing people who aren't necessarily socially linked. So that's nice and convenient. Some people just don't write them because they refuse because it's not fun. Those people need to suck it up and be better engineers, let's be honest. You can't be a good engineer and not write tests. I know companies who focus and have a QA engineer and a regular engineer, and like that's a really weird distinction to me. That makes no sense. Don't do that. It's terrible. And then finally, some people don't write tests because they just don't know how, again. Like if you've never done it, writing the first test that you've ever written in your entire career, like it's not going to make any sense to you as a concept, even if you understand the concept of trying to work your code all the way through all the possibilities. There's lots of tooling that you might not be understanding. There's lots of structure. There's lots of concepts that maybe you haven't just seen before. And so developing that skill for people who've never done it before is super important to getting this to happen for you. Sometimes people don't write tests because they just know that nobody cares. The tests aren't being run on a CI machine, so the current tests don't pass. I can't believe anyone does this at any company, but like if you have this at your company, your test suite is currently not passing and you're here at a conference, I hope nobody's gonna get up and leave, but please leave, just go away. You need to fix this. This is the prime emergency of your weekend. I mean, maybe not weekend, nobody's working on the weekend, go on Monday, but nonetheless, fix this now, make a CI machine, and use all of the tools that GitHub or GitLab or whatever you're using lets you do so that you are not allowed to merge until your CI passes. Machine automation and machine enforcement of rules is maybe the easiest way to get this to happen. And then some people don't write tests because all of the infrastructure that they need to write or the mocks that they need to write is just a pain in the butt and they don't really want to do it, so they're not going to. So they're just going to hand wash it and it doesn't happen. Testing can help you improve a bunch of things. So this is here mostly to give you ammunition if you are referring to this talk in real life before you go talk to your boss about why you don't have unit tests and how you're upset about this. So in general, most people are pretty familiar with this. Reliability and correctness are pretty big. Having certainty about your code and the code's interactions with other pieces of code that you haven't written before you deploy is really nice. No one likes gambling, and this is just so much better to have those tests in place. A point that I don't hear as often is that writing tests lets you be the first user of your code if the code is intended to be used by anyone. And I mean that in the sense of like how other people are intended to call the methods or set up the class before they use it. So you writing a test where you have to set it up and you've written it is fantastic because it gives other people a place to go and look to say, okay, well, The Python doesn't have any types, so I need to figure out what the heck I'm supposed to put here as this context object. Oh, they've used it from this place. Okay, I got it. This makes a lot more sense of how to use it. And then preventing feature loss. Some people, other code might break your code, and then people will not necessarily know that that's an actual feature of the code that you're working on. So having this cross-interaction prevention helps you not stress about the feature that you're going to get a phone call for. So convincing people of the importance of this means that you should probably set some really well-defined goals. You can't convince people to sign up for infinite yak shaving. And that would come up if someone said to me, let's write a test for the entire and get 100% code coverage before we do anything else. No one will ever agree to that, like, ever. So my current scope is focused on the following three things. Anti-regression, so anytime anyone fixes a bug, you write a test to guarantee that the bug never happens again. Especially in a customer-facing environment, you've all had a bug happen more than once on the same thing, and the customer gets really frustrated, and preventing this regression can save a lot of customer goodwill that you would like to save for future difficulties. The other two rules we have are that new code means writing new tests, and that we have projects in the works to set up the proper testing infrastructure. Right now, we have some UI-based testing that is run against a dev database that people can change the data structure in that doesn't necessarily correspond to prod. This is not a safe piece of infrastructure to rely on as a test, so fixing that is an important thing. Yeah, so you can have other options. You don't have to do what I do. I highly recommend the regression test rule. It's super useful because you've literally had someone care so much about this bug that they've filed a bug report for you, or they've emailed you and complained about it. That's feedback about how they care about your product in a huge way. So never, ever break it again because somebody else cared about it. So your other options can include feature parity loss prevention. So if you're refactoring a code base that doesn't have a lot of tests or something like that, adding code to test to a legacy project is really valuable. Or leveling up your test skills is also super good. So some people are super into distributed systems these days as like the current web buzzword, and testing distributed things is a little bit more challenging. There's definitely best practices that are starting to develop, but if you are not personally familiar with them, this can be a really good project to say, hey, I don't think our reliability is strong enough. Let's improve our team's knowledge of this so that when we're writing the tests that they're real and that they actually prove things. Now, it's important to note that you should set limits on these goals. So if I am choosing the feature parity prevention one, I would highly recommend picking a code coverage goal for certain areas of the code and going, okay, I need these modules 100% covered, but these ones can be, like the rest of the project just has to get up to 80. And setting those goals will prevent you from going and trying to run that last mile where you're not getting very far. So to convince anyone of anything, you have to get some buy-in. So I personally highly recommend co-conspirators. I'm a pretty new developer at my job, and while that's super exciting because it means I have so many things to learn, it means that I don't nearly have as much credibility as the people who've been there for the whole time. And I'm not nearly as familiar with previous and past design decisions. So convincing other people before you talk to before you talk widely about this can give you the credibility that a senior dev can lend you. And also code reviewing means that there's a second person who's also fully committed to this and going to complain about your tests or other people's tests when you're not doing the code reviews. So before you're going to do anything, you want to gather some information because it's hugely powerful in convincing anyone of everything. You need to review past outages because you need to be able to say, the last time that I woke up at 2 in the morning, if we'd had a test checking this, it wouldn't have woken me up, and I'm really not happy about this. if you're planning a big upgrade, Django is a good example. Between versions, having tests to check the important parts of your code are going to save your bacon. Having a heat map of code coverage is nice, just to say, like, these areas are really patchy, but we have really good stuff in this other area. Makes it a lot more clear as to what you're looking for. Because someone will say, but we have tests. Like, well, we're missing tests in the transmogrifier unit, and that's really not great, because it does all of the financial transactions. And having good code examples for people to say, like, we have these tests, but our tests are shitty, and these are the good tests, and giving people those examples is super, super useful in the sense that now you have a much better idea of what you need to work towards. So convincing your boss can be challenging. This was the slide that people have asked me about the most so far, whether I was going to talk about this. So you need to ask for what you want, and you need to give them the scope of that right away, because otherwise they're just going to say, no, you want to dig a hole to China, that's really far, we're just not doing this. Framing your goals in alignment with things that they care about, rather than what you as a developer cares about, is super great. For example, customers might experience less disruptions. Your developer's turnover might go away because all of a sudden it's way less stressful to work at your company. And also, you might have just better communication between your developers and the product stakeholders. I know every time I write tests, I come up with questions about the details of the implementation that I haven't thought about. And since software is basically just a pile of big decisions that you've all made over years and years and years, writing tests right when you're writing the code, before it's in production, before other people have touched it and developed dependencies on it, means that you're not changing so many things all the time. So that's super valuable. Sometimes you might have to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. You probably don't want to work with these companies. If your boss says no to, I want to have more tests, you're never going to stop having to wake up at 4 in the morning to an urgent page that all the infrastructure is just not working. This is not okay. You do not want to work there. Find a new job. I know this is a little bit arrogant, right? Like, not everyone can change jobs immediately right now. But if you can't convince people to let you write tests and you're a software developer, you're not going to, don't do it. That's all I have to say on that one. So their reactions might vary. Your boss might be like, well, this is a dumb idea. I don't want to do it. We're not doing it. It has no customer viability, whatever. But they might also be super enthusiastic, or they might have no idea why you should care, even if you've just told them why they should care. In general, having the goal of this meeting be to look for some goals, or like to focus on these things is super helpful. So you really want permission to have a chat with your coworkers to set some norms and values. And you want their support, because if you're me, you can't performance manage the people who aren't playing the game, who aren't writing tests, even after you've said, hey, we're doing this now. And approval to put new testing infrastructure into the pipeline. So that's what I'm looking for. Your stuff might vary depending on what you're doing. So now you are going to have a chat with your coworkers. You don't need to explain explicitly how to write tests. Most developers feel like they already know, and this will most likely be taken as somewhat offensive. But you do need to set expectations for what you want to do in the future, and what you want them to do in the future. And you can give them a heads up about what projects you have in the backlog that are coming up that are test related as well. Some things that you should mention just as nice bonuses for having tests. Stuff that I've mentioned previously, but selling these facts to your coworkers is super valuable, just to convince them that you're not just wasting their time making them write code that they don't need to write. So new expectations that you need to set. You need to mention the specific goal that you've chosen. So mine is not being scared every time I push to production, because that's terrifying. And manual testing doesn't fix this, so it's still a gamble, right? Talking about code review expectations. When you start doing this, you need to have other people code reviewing and failing people for not sufficiently testing, or making comments about how they need to reduce the number of tests that they have because the tests that they have are a little extensive and ridiculous. But yeah, in general, quality and number are now failable offenses. You should not pass tests or pass merge requests if they don't have tests. It's just not going to be a thing. And the third rule, the regression rule that I'm into very much, write the tests to verify anytime you write any bug fixes. It does change a lot of things. Notwithstanding, it now means that you get to go to the customer and say, we've made sure this will never happen again, which sounds a lot more credible than, yeah, we've looked into it and we figured out what it was. So part of this is changing the culture, and you can't just do that without doing any maintenance. You can't do this once or 10 days in a row and then never think about it again. This needs to be a thing that you think about all the time. Part of that is because this project and this focus on tests is part one of your journey to a more reliability-focused culture, which is fundamentally a journey of mindset. So you have to start at the bottom where testing is the focus, but you can move on to more varied topics as you go on. So you need to keep doing the work. You need to continue the education of the people that you work with, whether that's your senior developer talking about test methods at a town hall, whether that's you sending out around an email saying, hey, I saw a really awesome test. Here's the link in your code base. Keep it up. Whether that's adding a code review checklist to the GitHub text box. And you need to review metrics. You need to know that this is actually happening and improving. And if it's not, you need to do things about it, like having more discussions with your developers about why it's not working, why this isn't getting better. If there are folks that really aren't on board, this is where you can get management involved. And they can speak more sternly to this person, or it can involve more performance management, which I'm grateful not to be qualified to do yet. So when you're planning future code, this gets to now be a focus of your code. If you are not thinking about this while you plan your architecture, you're kind of going to struggle when you try to implement. So if you're adding Celery because you like queues and you're not going to test with Celery, you're going to have a rough time. Eager mode doesn't work to get you where you want to be, which is a really big problem when you're writing tests because you want it to be as close to real as possible. Dockerizing of your infrastructure is a thing that I would like to promote, just to get as close to what you are doing in prod as possible. That gets you pretty darn close, plus or minus the environment variable set to dev or prod. And if you're going to choose to write a distributed system, you need to research testing. I'm picking on distributed systems because they're the new hot thing, but in general, if you're doing a new kind of thing that you're not really super familiar with the best practices for, you need to research them. There are tons of resources on the internet for what is a good distributed test, but you cannot just sit here and tell me that you've written unit tests and you can move on with your life. It's just not going to work. And again, when you're planning, this is the time to put in time for planning supportive infrastructure. It's just make it a part of your base MVP, and a lot of things will be much better. Additionally, you need to have an onboarding meeting now. It's part of the maintenance process is any new people into your culture need to be indoctrinated. I use indoctrinated loosely. Please do not actually cult your test culture. It's not great either. So you should probably make sure that any new hire knows how to run the tests. I know for a fact that there are people who've worked for like 2 or 3 weeks having pushed code to production and not run the tests locally on their machine, which seems problematic to me. I'll let you decide whether that's a problem to you, but they're meant to be run. So going through the review checklist for a code review is really valuable for them because then they can sort of get a sense of what's being expected of them. Having really clear information about that kind of thing is super nice. Giving them some good test examples from your code base, just to point them at it, especially as a new developer, I know for a fact that I have copy-pasted a piece of code, edited it heavily to make a better test suite, like to write my own tests, but it's all there for you, and that does matter. And consider pairing with them. Consider pairing with new people in general. Maybe their first PR, you just sit with them and you both work on it. Maybe just for the test. It really depends on the context, but yeah, pairing is a really good way to sort of give people a tour of their new workforce. So, and finally, you sometimes just have to give up. Acceptance is just a reality. You can't test everything. You can't have a perfect test suite. You can't control everything that your test interfaces with or your code interfaces with. AWS is an external feature. You have to assume that sometimes stuff is going to change and you're not going to know. You can't test scaling or load or concurrency issues. You can't test all of those places that somebody has written, if dev do this, if prod do this in your code. That's just not going to work. And there's never enough time to write infinite tests. You all want to go write more tests than you have, and you've wanted to for a long time probably, but you haven't had time, and that's just a reality of how it works. Okay, so I just want to leave you all with this. Don't forget, write tests to prevent regressions. If you have a bug, this is probably the only way to move forward in your life. And 2, tests are free documentation. This is great. Take advantage of it. Thanks.